Chapter 26 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
September 23rd. Our guests arrived about 3 weeks ago. Lord and Lady Loughborough have now been married above 8 months, and I will do the lady the credit to say that her husband is quite an altered man. His looks, his spirit, and his temper are all perceptibly changed for the better since I last saw him. But there is room for improvement still. He is not always cheerful, nor always contented, and she often complains of his ill humour, which, however, of all persons, she ought to be the last to accuse him of, as he never displays it against her, except for such conduct as would provoke a saint. He adores her still, and would go to the world's end to please her. She knows her power, and she uses it too. But well knowing that to wheedle and coax is safer than to command, she judiciously tempers her despotism with flattery and blandishments enough to make him deem himself a favoured and a happy man. But she has a way of tormenting him, in which I am a fellow sufferer, or might be, if I chose to regard myself as such. This is by openly, but not too glaringly, coquetting with Mr. Huntingdon, who is quite willing to be her partner in the game. But I don't care for it, because with him I know there is nothing but personal vanity, and a mischievous desire to excite my jealousy, and, perhaps, to torment his friend, and she, no doubt, is actuated by much the same motives, only there is more of malice and less of playfulness in her manoeuvres. It is obviously, therefore, my interest to disappoint them both, as far as I am concerned, by preserving a cheerful, undisturbed serenity throughout; and, accordingly, I endeavour to show the fullest confidence in my husband, and the greatest indifference to the arts of my attractive guest. I have never reproached the former but once, and that was for laughing at Lord Loughborough's depressed and anxious countenance one evening, when they had both been particularly provoking; and then, indeed, I said a good deal on the subject, and rebuked him sternly enough, but he only laughed and said,
"You can feel for him, Helen, can't you?"
"I can feel for any one that is unjustly treated," I replied, "and I can feel for those that injure them too."
"Why, Helen, you're as jealous as he is,"
cried he, laughing still more, and I found it impossible to convince him of his mistake. So, from that time, I have carefully refrained from any notice of the subject whatever, and left Lord Loughborough to take care of himself. He either has not the sense or the power to follow my example, though he does try to conceal his uneasiness as well as he can; but still it will appear in his face, and his ill humour will peep out at intervals, though not in the expression of open resentment; they never go far enough for that. But I confess I do feel jealous at times, most painfully, bitterly so, when she sings and plays to him, and he hangs over the instrument, and dwells upon her voice with no affected interest; for then I know he is really delighted, and I have no power to awaken similar fervour. I can amuse and please him with my simple songs, but not delight him thus. 28th. Yesterday we all went to the Grove, Mr. Hargrave's much neglected home. His mother frequently asks us over, that she may have the pleasure of her dear Walter's company; and this time she had invited us to a dinner party, and got together as many of the country gentry as were within reach to meet us. The entertainment was very well got up, but I could not help thinking about the cost of it all the time. I don't like Mrs. Hargrave; she is a hard, pretentious, worldly-minded woman; she has money enough to live very comfortably, if she only knew how to use it judiciously, and had taught her son to do the same; but she is ever straining to keep up appearances, with that despicable pride that shuns the semblance of poverty as of a shameful crime. She grinds her dependents, pinches her servants, and deprives even her daughters and herself of the real comforts of life, because she will not consent to yield the palm in outward show to those who have 3 times her wealth; and above all, because she is determined her cherished son shall be enabled to
hold up his head with the highest gentleman in the land.
This same son, I imagine, is a man of expensive habits, no reckless spendthrift, and no abandoned sensualist, but one who likes to have everything handsome about him, and to go to a certain length in youthful indulgences, not so much to gratify his own tastes as to maintain his reputation as a man of fashion in the world, and a respectable fellow among his own lawless companions, while he is too selfish to consider how many comforts might be obtained for his fond mother and sisters with the money he thus wastes upon himself. As long as they can contrive to make a respectable appearance once a year, when they come to town, he gives himself little concern about their private stintings and struggles at home. This is a harsh judgment to form of dear, noble-minded, generous-hearted Walter, but I fear it is too just. Mrs. Hargrave's anxiety to make good matches for her daughters is partly the cause, and partly the result, of these errors. By making a figure in the world, and showing them off to advantage, she hopes to obtain better chances for them, and by thus living beyond her legitimate means, and lavishing so much on their brother, she renders them portionless, and makes them burdens on her hands. Poor Millicent, I fear, has already fallen a sacrifice to the manoeuvrings of this mistaken mother, who congratulates herself on having so satisfactorily discharged her maternal duty, and hopes to do as well for Esther. But Esther is a child as yet, a little merry romp of 14, as honest-hearted and as guileless and simple as her sister, but with a fearless spirit of her own, that I fancy her mother will find some difficulty in bending to her purposes.
End of chapter 26. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
October 9th. It was on the night of the 4th, a little after tea, that Annabella had been singing and playing, with Arthur, as usual, at her side. She had ended her song, but still she sat at the instrument, and he stood leaning on the back of her chair, conversing in scarcely audible tones, with his face in very close proximity with hers. I looked at Lord Loughborough. He was at the other end of the room, talking with Messrs. Hargrave and Grimsby, but I saw him dart towards his lady and his host a quick, impatient glance, expressive of intense disquietude, at which Grimsby smiled. Determined to interrupt the tete-a-tete, I rose, and selecting a piece of music from the music-stand, stepped up to the piano, intending to ask the lady to play it, but I stood transfixed and speechless on seeing her seated there, listening, with what seemed an exultant smile on her flushed face, to his soft murmurings, with her hand quietly surrendered to his clasp. The blood rushed first to my heart, and then to my head, for there was more than this. Almost at the moment of my approach, he cast a hurried glance over his shoulder towards the other occupants of the room, and then ardently pressed the unresisting hand to his lips. On raising his eyes, he beheld me, and dropped them again, confounded and dismayed. She saw me too, and confronted me with a look of hard defiance. I laid the music on the piano, and retired. I felt ill, but I did not leave the room. Happily, it was getting late, and could not be long before the company dispersed. I went to the fire, and leant my head against the chimney-piece. In a minute or two, someone asked me if I felt unwell. I did not answer. Indeed, at the time, I knew not what was said, but I mechanically looked up, and saw Mr. Hargrave standing beside me on the rug.
"Shall I get you a glass of wine?"
said he. "No, thank you," I replied, and turning from him, I looked round. Lady Loughborough was beside her husband, bending over him as he sat, with her hand on his shoulder, softly talking and smiling in his face. And Arthur was at the table, turning over a book of engravings. I seated myself in the nearest chair, and Mr. Hargrave, finding his services were not desired, judiciously withdrew. Shortly after, the company broke up, and as the guests were retiring to their rooms, Arthur approached me, smiling with the utmost assurance.
Are you very angry, Helen?
Murmured he. This is no jest, Arthur, said I, seriously, but as calmly as I could. Unless you think it a jest to lose my affection for ever.
What, so bitter?
He exclaimed, laughingly, clasping my hand between both his, but I snatched it away, in indignation, almost in disgust, for he was obviously affected with wine.
Then I must go down on my knees,
said he, and kneeling before me, with clasped hands, uplifted in mock humiliation, he continued imploringly,
Forgive me, Helen. Dear Helen, forgive me, and I'll never do it again.
And burying his face in his handkerchief, he affected to sob aloud. Leaving him thus employed, I took my candle, and slipping quietly from the room, hastened upstairs as fast as I could. But he soon discovered that I had left him, and rushing up after me, caught me in his arms, just as I had entered the chamber, and was about to shut the door in his face.
No, no, by heaven, you shan't escape me so,
he cried. Then, alarmed at my agitation, he begged me not to put myself in such a passion, telling me I was white in the face and should kill myself if I did so. Let me go, then, I murmured, and immediately he released me. And it was well he did, for I was really in a passion. I sank into the easy-chair, and endeavoured to compose myself, for I wanted to speak to him calmly. He stood beside me, but did not venture to touch me, or to speak for a few seconds. Then, approaching a little nearer, he dropped on one knee, not in mock humility, but to bring himself near my level, and leaning his hand on the arm of the chair, he began in a low voice.
It is all nonsense, Helen, a jest, a mere nothing, not worth a thought. Will you never learn,
He continued more boldly,
that you have nothing to fear from me, that I love you wholly and entirely, or if,
he added with a lurking smile,
I ever give a thought to another, you may well spare it, for those fancies are here and gone like a flash of lightning, while my love for you burns on steadily, and forever, like the sun. You little exorbitant tyrant, will not that—
Be quiet a moment, will you, Arthur? Said I, and listen to me, and don't think I'm in a jealous fury. I am perfectly calm. Feel my hand. And I gravely extended it towards him, but closed it upon his with an energy that seemed to disprove the assertion, and made him smile. You needn't smile, sir, said I, still tightening my grasp, and looking steadfastly on him till he almost quailed before me. You may think it all very fine, Mr. Huntingdon, to amuse yourself with rousing my jealousy, but take care you don't rouse my hate instead, and when you have once extinguished my love, you will find it no easy matter to kindle it again.
Well, Helen, I won't repeat the offence, but I meant nothing by it, I assure you. I had taken too much wine. I was scarcely myself at the time.
You often take too much, and that is another practice I detest. He looked up, astonished at my warmth. Yes, I continued, I never mentioned it before, because I was ashamed to do so. But now I'll tell you that it distresses me, and may disgust me, if you go on and suffer the habit to grow upon you, as it will if you don't check it in time. But the whole system of your conduct to Lady Loughborough is not referable to wine, and this night you knew perfectly well what you were doing.
Well, I'm sorry for it,
replied he, with more of sulkiness than contrition.
What more would you have?
You are sorry that I saw you, no doubt, I answered coldly.
If you had not seen me,
he muttered, fixing his eyes on the carpet,
it would have done no harm.
My heart felt ready to burst, but I resolutely swallowed back my emotion and answered calmly, You think not?
No,
replied he boldly.
After all, what have I done? It's nothing, except as you choose to make it a subject of accusation and distress.
What would Lord Loughborough, your friend, think if he knew all? Or what would you yourself think, if he or any other had acted the same part to me, throughout, as you have to Annabella?
I would blow his brains out.
Well then, Arthur, how can you call it nothing? An offence for which you would think yourself justified in blowing another man's brains out? Is it nothing to trifle with your friend's feelings, and mine? To endeavour to steal a woman's affections from her husband, what he values more than his gold, and therefore what it is more dishonest to take? Are the marriage vows a jest, and is it nothing to make it your sport to break them, and to tempt another to do the same? Can I love a man that does such things, and coolly maintains it as nothing?
You are breaking your marriage vows yourself,
said he, indignantly rising and pacing to and fro.
You promised to honour and obey me, and now you attempt to hector over me, and threaten and accuse me, and call me worse than a highwayman. If it were not for your situation, Helen, I would not submit to it so tamely. I won't be dictated by a woman, though she be my wife.
What will you do then? Will you go on till I hate you, and then accuse me of breaking my vows? He was silent a moment, and then replied,
You never will hate me.
Returning and resuming his former position at my feet, he repeated more vehemently,
You cannot hate me, as long as I love you.
But how can I believe that you love me, if you continue to act in this way? Just imagine yourself in my place. Would you think I loved you, if I did so? Would you believe my protestations, and honour and trust me under such circumstances?
The cases are different,
he replied.
It is a woman's nature to be constant, to love one, and one only, blindly, tenderly, and forever. Bless them, dear creatures, and you above them all. But you must have some commiseration for us, Helen. You must give us a little more license, for as Shakespeare has it, however we do praise ourselves, our fancies are more giddy and unfirm, more longing, wavering, sooner lost and won, than women's are.
Do you mean by that your fancies are lost to me, and won by Lady Loughborough?
No. Heaven is my witness that I think her mere dust and ashes in comparison with you, and shall continue to think so, unless you drive me from you by too much severity. She is a daughter of earth, you are an angel of heaven. Only be not too austere in your divinity, and remember that I am a poor, fallible mortal. Come now, Helen, won't you forgive me?
He said, gently taking my hand, and looking up with an innocent smile. If I do, you will repeat the offence.
I swear by—
Don't swear. I'll believe your word as well as your oath. I wish I could have confidence in either.
Try me then, Helen. Only trust and pardon me this once, and you shall see. Come, I am in hell's torment till you speak the word.
I did not speak it, but I put my hand on his shoulder, and kissed his forehead, and then burst into tears. He embraced me tenderly, and we have been good friends ever since. He has been decently temperate at table, and well conducted towards Lady Loughborough. The first day he held himself aloof from her, as far as he could without any flagrant breach of hospitality. Since that he has been friendly and civil, but nothing more, in my presence at least, nor, I think, at any other time, for she seems haughty and displeased, and Lord Loughborough is manifestly more cheerful and more cordial towards his host than before. But I shall be glad when they are gone, for I have so little love for Annabella, that it is quite a task to be civil to her, and as she is the only woman here besides myself, we are necessarily thrown so much together. Next time Mrs. Hargrave calls, I shall hail her advent as quite a relief. I have a good mind to ask Arthur's leave to invite the old lady to stay with us till our guests depart. I think I will. She will take it as a kind attention, and though I have little relish for her society, she will be truly welcome as a third to stand between Lady Loughborough and me. The first time the latter and I were alone together, after that unhappy evening, was an hour or two after breakfast on the following day, when the gentlemen were gone out, after the usual time spent in the writing of letters, the reading of newspapers, and desultory conversation. We sat silent for 2 or 3 minutes. She was busy with her work, and I was running over the columns of a paper from which I had extracted all the pith some 20 minutes before. It was a moment of painful embarrassment to me, and I thought it must be infinitely more so to her. But it seems I was mistaken. She was the first to speak, and smiling with the coolest assurance, she began,
"Your husband was merry last night, Helen. Is he often so?"
My blood boiled in my face, but it was better she should seem to attribute his conduct to this than to anything else. "No," replied I, "and never will be so again, I trust."
You gave him a curtain lecture, did you?
"No, but I told him I disliked such conduct, and he promised me not to repeat it."
I thought he looked rather subdued this morning,
she continued.
And you, Helen, you've been weeping, I see. That's our grand resource, you know. But doesn't it make your eyes smart? And do you always find it to answer?
I never cry for effect, nor can I conceive how anyone can.
Well, I don't know. I never had occasion to try it. But I think if Loughborough were to commit such improprieties, I'd make him cry. I don't wonder at your being angry, for I'm sure I'd give my husband a lesson he would not soon forget for a lighter offence than that. But then he never will do anything of the kind, for I keep him in too good order for that.
Are you sure you don't arrogate too much of the credit to yourself? Lord Loughborough was quite as remarkable for his abstemiousness for some time before you married him, as he is now, I have heard.
Oh, about the wine, you mean? Yes, he's safe enough for that. And as to looking askance to another woman, he's safe enough for that too while I live, for he worships the very ground I tread on.
Indeed? And are you sure you deserve it?
Why, as to that, I can't say. You know we're all fallible creatures, Helen. We none of us deserve to be worshipped. But are you sure your darling Huntingdon deserves all the love you give to him?
I knew not what to answer to this. I was burning with anger, but I suppressed all outward manifestations of it, and only bit my lip, and pretended to arrange my work.
At any rate,
resumed she, pursuing her advantage,
you can console yourself with the assurance that you are worthy of all the love he gives to you.
You flatter me, said I, but, at least, I can try to be worthy of it. And then I turned the conversation.
End of chapter 27. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
December 25th. Last Christmas I was a bride, with a heart overflowing with present bliss, and full of ardent hopes for the future, though not unmingled with foreboding fears. Now I am a wife. My bliss is sobered, but not destroyed. My hopes diminished, but not departed. My fears increased, but not yet thoroughly confirmed. And, thank heaven, I am a mother too. God has sent me a soul to educate for heaven, and give me a new and calmer bliss, and stronger hopes to comfort me. December 25th, 1823. Another year is gone. My little Arthur lives and thrives. He is healthy, but not robust, full of gentle playfulness and vivacity, already affectionate, and susceptible of passions and emotions it will be long ere he can find words to express. He has won his father's heart at last, and now my constant terror is, lest he should be ruined by that father's thoughtless indulgence. But I must beware of my own weakness too, for I never knew till now how strong are a parent's temptations to spoil an only child. I have need of consolation in my son, for, to this silent paper I may confess it, I have but little in my husband. I love him still, and he loves me, in his own way. But oh, how different from the love I could have given, and once had hoped to receive! How little real sympathy there exists between us! How many of my thoughts and feelings are gloomily cloistered within my own mind! How much of my higher and better self is indeed unmarried, doomed either to harden and sour in the sunless shade of solitude, or to quite degenerate and fall away for lack of nutriment in this unwholesome soil! But, I repeat, I have no right to complain. Only let me state the truth, some of the truth, at least, and see hereafter if any darker truths will blot these pages. We have now been full 2 years united. The romance of our attachment must be worn away. Surely I have now got down to the lowest gradation in Arthur's affection, and discovered all the evils of his nature. If there be any further change, it must be for the better, as we become still more accustomed to each other. Surely we shall find no lower depth than this, and if so, I can bear it well. As well, at least, as I have borne it hitherto. Arthur is not what is commonly called a bad man. He has many good qualities, but he is a man without self-restraint or lofty aspirations, a lover of pleasure, given up to animal enjoyments. He's not a bad husband, but his notions of matrimonial duties and comforts are not my notions. Judging from appearances, his idea of a wife is a thing to love one devotedly, and to stay at home to wait upon her husband, and amuse him, and minister to his comfort in every possible way, while he chooses to stay with her, and, when he is absent, to attend to his interests, domestic or otherwise, and patiently wait his return, no matter how he may be occupied in the meantime. Early in spring he announced his intention of going to London. His affairs there demanded his attendance, he said, and he could refuse it no longer. He expressed his regret at having to leave me, but hoped I would amuse myself with the baby till he returned. "But why leave me?" I said. "I can go with you. I can be ready at any time."
You would not take the child to town?
Yes, why not? The thing was absurd. The air of the town would be certain to disagree with him, and with me as a nurse. The late hours and London habits would not suit me, under such circumstances, and altogether he assured me that it would be excessively troublesome, injurious, and unsafe. I overruled his objections as well as I could, for I trembled at the thoughts of his going alone, and would sacrifice almost anything for myself, much even for my child, to prevent it. But at length he told me plainly, and somewhat testily, that he could not do with me. He was worn out with the baby's restless nights, and must have some repose. I proposed separate apartments, but it would not do. "The truth is, Arthur," I said at last, "you are weary of my company, and determined not to have me with you. You might as well have said so at once." He denied it, but I immediately left the room, and flew to the nursery, to hide my feelings, if I could not soothe them there. I was too much hurt to express any further dissatisfaction with his plans, or at all to refer to the subject again, except for the necessary arrangements concerning his departure, and the conduct of affairs during his absence, till the day before he went, when I earnestly exhorted him to take care of himself, and keep out of the way of temptation. He laughed at my anxiety, but assured me there was no cause for it, and promised to attend to my advice. "I suppose it is no use asking you to fix a day for your return," said I.
Why, no. I hardly can, under the circumstances, but be assured, love, I shall not be long away.
"I don't wish to keep you a prisoner at home," I replied. "I should not grumble at your staying whole months away, if you can be happy so long without me, provided I knew you were safe. But I don't like the idea of your being there among your friends, as you call them."
Pooh, you silly girl. Do you think I can take care of myself?
"You didn't last time. But this time, Arthur," I added earnestly, "show me that you can, and teach me that I need not fear to trust you." He promised fair, but in such a manner as we seek to soothe a child. And did he keep his promise? No, and henceforth I can never trust his word. Bitter, bitter confession! Tears blind me while I write. It was early in March that he went, and he did not return till July. This time he did not trouble himself to make excuses as before, and his letters were less frequent, and shorter and less affectionate, especially after the first few weeks. They came slower and slower, and more terse and careless every time. But still, when I omitted writing, he complained of my neglect. When I wrote sternly and coldly, as I confess I frequently did at the last, he blamed my harshness, and said it was enough to scare him from his home. When I tried mild persuasion, he was a little more gentle in his replies, and promised to return. But I had learnt, at last, to disregard his promises.
End of chapter 28. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Those were 4 miserable months, alternating between intense anxiety, despair, and indignation, pity for him and pity for myself. And yet, through all, I was not wholly comfortless. I had my darling, sinless, inoffensive little one to console me. But even this consolation was embittered by the constantly recurring thought, how shall I teach him hereafter to respect his father, and yet to avoid his example? But I remembered that I had brought all these afflictions, in a manner wilfully, upon myself, and I determined to bear them without a murmur. At the same time I resolved not to give myself up to misery for the transgressions of another, and endeavoured to divert myself as much as I could. And besides the companionship of my child, and my dear, faithful Rachel, who evidently guessed my sorrows and felt for them, though she was too discreet to allude to them, I had my books and pencil, my domestic affairs, and the welfare and comfort of Arthur's poor tenants and labourers to attend to, and I sometimes sought and obtained amusement in the company of my young friend Esther Hargrave. Occasionally I rode over to see her, and once or twice I had her to spend the day with me at the Manor. Mrs. Hargrave did not visit London that season. Having no daughter to marry, she thought it as well to stay at home and economize, and, for a wonder, Walter came down to join her in the beginning of June, and stayed till near the close of August. The first time I saw him was on a sweet warm evening, when I was sauntering in the park with little Arthur and Rachel, who was head nurse and lady's maid in one; for, with my secluded life and tolerably active habits, I require but little attendance, and as she had nursed me and coveted to nurse my child, and was moreover so very trustworthy, I preferred committing the important charge to her, with a young nursery maid under her directions, to engaging any one else. Besides, it saves money, and since I have made acquaintance with Arthur's affairs, I have learnt to regard that as no trifling recommendation; for, by my own desire, nearly the whole of the income of my fortune is devoted, for years to come, to the paying off of his debts, and the money he contrives to squander away in London is incomprehensible. But to return to Mr. Hargrave. I was standing with Rachel beside the water, amusing the laughing baby in her arms with a twig of willow laden with golden catkins, when, greatly to my surprise, he entered the park, mounted on his costly black hunter, and crossed over the grass to meet me. He saluted me with a very fine compliment, delicately worded, and modestly delivered withal, which he had doubtless concocted as he rode along. He told me he had brought a message from his mother, who, as he was riding that way, had desired him to call at the Manor, and begged the pleasure of my company to a friendly family dinner to-morrow.
"There is no one to meet but ourselves,"
said he.
"but Esther is very anxious to see you, and my mother fears you will feel solitary in this great house so much alone, and wishes she could persuade you to give her the pleasure of your company more frequently, and make yourself at home in our more humble dwelling, till Mr. Huntingdon's return shall render this a little more conducive to your comfort."
"She is very kind," I answered, "but I am not alone, you see, and those whose time is fully occupied seldom complain of solitude."
"Will you not come to-morrow, then? She will be sadly disappointed if you refuse."
I did not relish being thus compassionated for my loneliness, but, however, I promised to come.
"What a sweet evening this is,"
observed he, looking round upon the sunny park, with its imposing swell and slope, its placid water, and majestic clumps of trees.
"and what a paradise you live in."
"It is a lovely evening," answered I, and I sighed to think how little I had felt its loveliness, and how little of a paradise Sweet Grassdale was to me; how still less to the voluntary exile from its scenes. Whether Mr. Hargrave divined my thoughts I cannot tell, but, with a half-hesitating, sympathizing seriousness of tone and manner, he asked if I had lately heard from Mr. Huntingdon. "Not lately," I replied.
"I thought not,"
he muttered, as if to himself, looking thoughtfully on the ground. "Are you not lately returned from London?" I asked.
"Only yesterday."
"And did you see him there?"
"Yes, I saw him."
"Was he well?"
"Yes, that is—"
said he, with increasing hesitation, and an appearance of suppressed indignation.
He was as well as he deserved to be, but under circumstances I should have deemed incredible for a man so favoured as he is.
He here looked up, and pointed the sentence with a serious bow to me. I suppose my face was crimson.
Pardon me, Mrs. Huntingdon,
he continued,
but I cannot suppress my indignation when I behold such infatuated blindness and perversion of taste. But perhaps you are not aware—
He paused. I am aware of nothing, sir, except that he delays his coming longer than I expected, and if at present he prefers the society of his friends to that of his wife, and the dissipations of the town to the quiet of country life, I suppose I have those friends to thank for it. Their tastes and occupations are similar to his, and I don't see why his conduct should awaken either their indignation or surprise.
You wrong me cruelly,
answered he.
I have shared but little of Mr. Huntingdon's society for the last few weeks, and as for his tastes and occupations, they are quite beyond me, lonely wanderer as I am. Where I have but sipped and tasted, he drains the cup to the dregs, and if ever for a moment I have sought to drown the voice of reflection in madness and folly, or if I have wasted too much of my time and talents among reckless and dissipated companions, God knows I would gladly renounce them entirely and for ever, if I had but half the blessings that man so thanklessly casts behind his back, but half the inducements to virtue and domestic, orderly habits that he despises, but such a home, and such a partner to share it. It is infamous,
he muttered between his teeth.
And don't think, Mrs. Huntingdon,
he added aloud,
that I could be guilty of inciting him to persevere in his present pursuits. On the contrary, I have remonstrated with him again and again. I have frequently expressed my surprise at his conduct, and reminded him of his duties and his privileges, but to no purpose. He only—
Enough, Mr. Hargrave. You ought to be aware that whatever my husband's faults may be, it can only aggravate the evil for me to hear them from a stranger's lips.
Am I then a stranger?
said he in a sorrowful tone.
I am your nearest neighbour, your son's godfather, and your husband's friend. May I not be yours also?
Intimate acquaintance must precede real friendship. I know but little of you, Mr. Hargrave, except from report.
Have you then forgotten the 6 or 7 weeks I spent under your roof last autumn? I have not forgotten them, and I know enough of you, Mrs. Huntingdon, to think that your husband is the most enviable man in the world, and I should be the next, if you would deem me worthy of your friendship.
If you knew more of me, you would not think it, or if you did, you would not say it, and expect me to be flattered by the compliment. I stepped backward as I spoke. He saw that I wished the conversation to end, and immediately taking the hint, he gravely bowed, wished me good evening, and turned his horse towards the road. He appeared grieved and hurt at my unkind reception of his sympathizing overtures. I was not sure that I had done right in speaking so harshly to him, but at the time I had felt irritated, almost insulted by his conduct. It seemed as if he was presuming upon the absence and neglect of my husband, and insinuating even more than the truth against him. Rachel had moved on, during our conversation, to some yards' distance. He rode up to her, and asked to see the child. He took it carefully into his arms, looked upon it with an almost paternal smile, and I heard him say as I approached,
And this, too, he has forsaken.
He then tenderly kissed it, and restored it to the gratified nurse. Are you fond of children, Mr. Hargrave? said I, a little softened towards him.
Not in general,
he replied.
But that is such a sweet child, and so like its mother,
he added in a lower tone. You are mistaken there. It is its father it resembles.
Am I not right, nurse?
said he, appealing to Rachel.
I think, sir, there's a bit of both,
she replied. He departed, and Rachel pronounced him a very nice gentleman. I had still my doubts on the subject. In the course of the following 6 weeks I met him several times, but always, save once, in company with his mother, or his sister, or both. When I called on them, he always happened to be at home, and when they called on me, it was always he that drove them over in the phaeton. His mother, evidently, was quite delighted with his dutiful attentions and newly acquired domestic habits. The time that I met him alone was on a bright but not oppressively hot day, in the beginning of July. I had taken little Arthur into the wood that skirts the park, and there seated him on the moss-cushioned roots of an old oak, and having gathered a handful of bluebells and wild roses, I was kneeling before him and presenting them, one by one, to the grasp of his tiny fingers, enjoying the heavenly beauty of the flowers through the medium of his smiling eyes, forgetting, for the moment, all my cares, laughing at his gleeful laughter, and delighting myself with his delight, when a shadow suddenly eclipsed the little space of sunshine on the grass before us, and looking up, I beheld Walter Hargrave standing and gazing upon us.
"Excuse me, Mrs. Huntingdon,"
said he,
"but I was spellbound. I had neither the power to come forward and interrupt you, nor to withdraw from the contemplation of such a scene. How vigorous my little godson grows, and how merry he is this morning!"
He approached the child, and stooped to take his hand, but, on seeing that his caresses were likely to produce tears and lamentations, instead of a reciprocation of friendly demonstrations, he prudently drew back.
"What a pleasure and comfort that little creature must be to you, Mrs. Huntingdon,"
he observed, with a touch of sadness in his intonation, as he admiringly contemplated the infant. "It is," replied I, and then I asked after his mother and sister. He politely answered my inquiries, and then returned again to the subject I wished to avoid, though with a degree of timidity that witnessed his fear to offend.
"You have not heard from Huntingdon lately?"
he said. "Not this week," I replied. Not these 3 weeks, I might have said.
"I had a letter from him this morning. I wish it were such a one as I could show to his lady."
He half drew from his waistcoat pocket a letter with Arthur's still beloved hand on the address, scowled at it, and put it back again, adding,
"But he tells me he is about to return next week."
"He tells me so every time he writes."
"Indeed. Well, it is like him. But to me he always avowed it his intention to stay till the present month."
It struck me like a blow, this proof of premeditated transgression and systematic disregard of truth.
"It is only of a piece with the rest of his conduct,"
observed Mr. Hargrave, thoughtfully regarding me, and reading, I suppose, my feelings in my face. "Then he is really coming next week?" said I, after a pause.
"You may rely upon it, if the assurance can give you any pleasure. And is it possible, Mrs. Huntingdon, that you can rejoice at his return?"
he exclaimed, attentively perusing my features again. "Of course, Mr. Hargrave. Is he not my husband?"
"Oh, Huntingdon, you know not what you slight,"
he passionately murmured. I took up my baby, and wishing him good morning, departed, to indulge my thoughts unscrutinized within the sanctum of my home. And was I glad? Yes, delighted, though I was angered by Arthur's conduct, and though I felt that he had wronged me, and was determined he should feel it too.
End of chapter 29. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
On the following morning I received a few lines from him myself, confirming Hargrave's intimations respecting his approaching return, and he did come next week, but in a condition of body and mind even worse than before. I did not, however, intend to pass over his derelictions this time without a remark. I found it would not do. But the first day he was weary with his journey, and I was glad to get him back. I would not upbraid him then. I would wait till to-morrow. Next morning he was weary still. I would wait a little longer. But at dinner, when, after breakfasting at 12 o'clock on a bottle of soda-water and a cup of strong coffee, and lunching at 2 on another bottle of soda-water, mingled with brandy, he was finding fault with everything on the table, and declaring we must change our cook, I thought the time was come. "It is the same cook as we had before you went, Arthur," said I. "You were generally pretty well satisfied with her then."
You must have been letting her get into slovenly habits then while I was away. It's enough to poison one eating such a disgusting mess.
And he pettishly pushed away his plate, and leant back despairingly in his chair. "I think it is you that are changed, not she," said I, but with the utmost gentleness, for I did not wish to irritate him.
It may be so,
he replied carelessly, as he seized a tumbler of wine and water, adding, when he had tossed it off,
for I have an infernal fire in my veins that all the waters of the ocean cannot quench.
What kindled it? I was about to ask, but at that moment the butler entered and began to take away the things.
Be quick, Benson. Do have done with all that infernal clatter,
cried his master.
And don't bring the cheese unless you want to make me sick outright.
Benson, in some surprise, removed the cheese, and did his best to effect a quiet and speedy clearance of the rest. But unfortunately there was a rumple in the carpet, caused by the hasty pushing back of his master's chair, at which he tripped and stumbled, causing a rather alarming concussion with the trayful of crockery in his hands, but no positive damage, save the fall and breaking of a sauce tureen. But, to my unspeakable shame and dismay, Arthur turned furiously around upon him, and swore at him with savage coarseness. The poor man turned pale, and visibly trembled as he stooped to pick up the fragments. "He couldn't help it, Arthur," said I. "The carpet caught his foot, and there's no great harm done. Never mind the pieces now, Benson. You can clear them away afterwards." Glad to be released, Benson expeditiously set out the dessert and withdrew.
What could you mean, Helen, by taking the servant's part against me?
Said Arthur, as soon as the door was closed.
When you knew I was distracted.
I did not know you were distracted, Arthur, and the poor man was quite frightened and hurt at your sudden explosion.
Poor man indeed, and do you think I could stop to consider the feeling of an incessant brute like that, when my own nerves are racked and torn to pieces by his confounded blunders?
I never heard you complain of your nerves before.
And why shouldn't I have nerves as well as you?
Oh, I don't dispute your claim to their possession, but I never complain of mine.
No, how should you when you never do anything to try them?
Then why do you try yours, Arthur?
Do you think I have nothing to do but stay at home and take care of myself like a woman?
Is it impossible, then, to take care of yourself like a man when you go abroad? You told me that you could, and would, too, and you promised.
Come, come, Helen, don't begin with that nonsense now. I can't bear it.
Can't bear what? To be reminded of the promises you have broken?
Helen, you are cruel. If you knew how my heart throbbed and how every nerve thrilled through me while you spoke, you would spare me. You can pity a dolt of a servant for breaking a dish, but you have no compassion for me when my head is split in two, and all on fire with this consuming fever.
He leaned his head on his hand and sighed. I went to him and put my hand on his forehead. It was burning indeed. Then come with me into the drawing-room, Arthur, and don't take any more wine. You have taken several glasses since dinner, and eaten next to nothing all the day. How can that make you better? With some coaxing and persuasion, I got him to leave the table. When the baby was brought, I tried to amuse him with that. But poor little Arthur was cutting his teeth, and his father could not bear his complaints. Sentence of immediate banishment was passed upon him on the first indication of fretfulness. And, because in the course of the evening I went to share his exile for a little while, I was reproached, on my return, for preferring my child to my husband. I found the latter reclining on the sofa just as I had left him.
Well,
exclaimed the injured man, in a tone of pseudo-resignation.
I thought I wouldn't send for you. I thought I'd just see how long it would please you to leave me alone.
I have not been very long, have I, Arthur? I have not been an hour, I'm sure.
Oh, of course, an hour is nothing to you, so pleasantly employed, but to me—
It has not been pleasantly employed, interrupted I. I have been nursing our poor little baby, who is very far from well, and I could not leave him till I got him to sleep.
Oh, to be sure, you're overflowing with kindness and pity for everything but me.
And why should I pity you? What is the matter with you?
Well, that passes everything. After all the wear and tear that I've had, when I come home sick and weary, longing for comfort, and expecting to find attention and kindness, at least from my wife, she calmly asks what is the matter with me.
There is nothing the matter with you, returned I, except what you have wilfully brought upon yourself, against my earnest exhortation and entreaty.
Now, Helen,
said he emphatically, half rising from his recumbent posture,
if you bother me with another word, I'll ring the bell and order 6 bottles of wine, and by heaven, I'll drink them dry before I stir from this place.
I said no more, but sat down before the table, and drew a book towards me.
Do let me have quietness at least,
continued he,
if you deny me every other comfort.
And sinking back into his former position, with an impatient expiration between a sigh and a groan, he languidly closed his eyes as if to sleep. What the book was that lay open on the table before me, I cannot tell, for I never looked at it. With an elbow on each side of it, and my hands clasped before my eyes, I delivered myself up to silent weeping. But Arthur was not asleep. At the first slight sob, he raised his head and looked round, impatiently exclaiming,
What are you crying for, Helen? What the deuce is the matter now?
I'm crying for you, Arthur, I replied, speedily drying my tears, and starting up, I threw myself on my knees before him, and clasping his nerveless hand between my own, continued, Don't you know that you are a part of myself? And do you think you can injure and degrade yourself, and I not feel it?
Degrade myself, Helen?
Yes, degrade! What have you been doing all this time?
You'd better not ask,
said he, with a faint smile. And you had better not tell. But you cannot deny that you have degraded yourself miserably. You have shamefully wronged yourself, body and soul, and me too, and I can't endure it quietly, and I won't.
Well, don't squeeze my hand so frantically, and don't agitate me so, for heaven's sake. Oh, Hattersley, you were right. This woman will be the death of me, with her keen feelings and her interesting force of character. There, do spare me a little.
Arthur, you must repent, cried I, in a frenzy of desperation, throwing my arms around him and burying my face in his bosom. You shall say you are sorry for what you have done.
Well, I am.
You are not. You'll do it again.
I shall never live to do it again if you treat me so savagely,
replied he, pushing me from him.
You've nearly squeezed the breath out of my body.
He pressed his hand to his heart, and looked really agitated and ill.
Now get me a glass of wine,
said he,
to remedy what you've done, you she-tiger. I'm almost ready to faint.
I flew to get the required remedy. It seemed to revive him considerably. What a shame it is, said I, as I took the empty glass from his hand, for a strong young man like you to reduce yourself to such a state.
If you knew all, my girl, you'd say rather, what a wonder it is you can bear it so well as you do. I've lived more in these 4 months, Helen, than you have in the whole course of your existence, or will to the end of your days if they numbered 100 years, so I must be expected to pay for it in some shape.
You will have to pay a higher price than you anticipate, if you don't take care. There will be the total loss of your own health, and of my affection too, if that is of any value to you.
What? You're at that game of threatening me with the loss of your affection again, are you? I think it couldn't have been very genuine stuff to begin with if it's so easily demolished. If you don't mind, my pretty tyrant, you'll make me regret my choice in good earnest and envy my friend Hattersley, his meek little wife. She's quite a pattern to her sex, Helen. He had her with him in London all the season, and she was no trouble at all. He might amuse himself just as he pleased in regular bachelor style, and she never complained of neglect. He might come home at any hour of the night or morning, or not come home at all, be sullen, sober, or gloriously drunk, and play the fool or the madman to his own heart's desire without any fear or botheration. She never gives him a word of reproach or complaint, do what he will. He says there's no such jewel in all England, and swears he wouldn't take a kingdom for her.
But he makes her life a curse to her.
Not he. She has no will but his, and is always content and happy as long as he is enjoying himself.
In that case, she is as great a fool as he is. But it is not so. I have several letters from her, expressing the greatest anxiety about his proceedings, and complaining that you incite him to commit those extravagances. One especially, in which she implores me to use my influence with you to get you away from London, and affirms that her husband never did such things before you came, and would certainly discontinue them as soon as you departed, and left him to the guidance of his own good sense.
The detestable little traitor! Give me the letter, and he shall see it as sure as I'm a living man.
No, he shall not see it without her consent. But if he did, there is nothing there to anger him, nor in any of the others. She never speaks a word against him. It is only anxiety for him that she expresses. She only alludes to his conduct in the most delicate terms, and makes every excuse for him that she can possibly think of. And as for her own misery, I rather feel it than see it expressed in her letters.
But she abuses me, and no doubt you helped her.
No, I told her she overrated my influence with you, that I would gladly draw you away from the temptations of the town if I could, but had little hope of success, and that I thought she was wrong in supposing that you enticed Mr. Hattersley, or anyone else, into error. I had myself held the contrary opinion at one time, but I now believed that you mutually corrupted each other, and perhaps, if she used a little gentle but serious remonstrance with her husband, it might be of some service, as, though he was more rough-hewn than mine, I believed he was of a less impenetrable material.
And so that is the way you go on, heartening each other up to mutiny, and abusing each other's partners, and throwing out implications against your own, to the mutual gratification of both.
According to your own account, said I, my evil counsel has had but little effect upon her. And as to abuse and aspersions, we are both of us far too deeply ashamed of the errors and vices of our other halves, to make them the common subject of our correspondence. Friends as we are, we would willingly keep your failings to ourselves, even from ourselves if we could, unless by knowing them we could deliver you from them.
Well, don't worry me about them. You'll never effect any good by that. Have patience with me, and bear with my languor and crossness a little while, till I get this cursed low fever out of my veins, and then you'll find me cheerful and kind as ever. Why can't you be gentle and good as you were last time? I'm sure I was very grateful for it."
"And what good did your gratitude do? I deluded myself with the idea that you were ashamed of your transgressions, and hoped you would never repeat them again. But now you have left me nothing to hope."
My case is quite desperate, is it? A very blessed consideration, if it will only secure me from the pain and worry of my dear anxious wife's efforts to convert me, and her from the toil and trouble of such exertions, and her sweet face and silver accents from the ruinous effects of the same. A burst of passion is a fine, rousing thing upon occasion, Helen, and a flood of tears is marvellously affecting, but when indulged too often, they are both deuced plaguy things for spoiling one's beauty and tiring out one's friends.
Thenceforth I restrained my tears and passions as much as I could. I spared him my exhortations and fruitless efforts at conversion too, for I saw it was all in vain. God might awaken that heart, supine and stupefied with self-indulgence, and remove the film of sensual darkness from his eyes, but I could not. His injustice and ill humour towards his inferiors, who could not defend themselves, I still resented and withstood. But when I alone was their object, as was frequently the case, I endured it with calm forbearance, except at times, when my temper, worn out by repeated annoyances, or stung to distraction by some new instance of irrationality, gave way in spite of myself, and exposed me to the imputations of fierceness, cruelty, and impatience. I attended carefully to his wants and amusements, but not, I own, with the same devoted fondness as before, because I could not feel it. Besides, I had now another claimant on my time and care, my ailing infant, for whose sake I frequently braved and suffered the reproaches and complaints of his unreasonably exacting father. But Arthur is not naturally a peevish or irritable man, so far from it, that there was something almost ludicrous in the incongruity of this adventitious fretfulness and nervous irritability, rather calculated to excite laughter than anger, if it were not for the intensely painful considerations attendant upon those symptoms of a disordered frame, and his temper gradually improved as his bodily health was restored, which was much sooner than would have been the case but for my strenuous exertions. For there was still one thing about him that I did not give up in despair, and one effort for his preservation that I would not remit. His appetite for the stimulus of wine had increased upon him, as I had too well foreseen. It was now something more to him than an accessory to social enjoyment. It was an important source of enjoyment in itself. In this time of weakness and depression, he would have made it his medicine and support, his comforter, his recreation, and his friend, and thereby sunk deeper and deeper, and bound himself down forever in the bathos wherein he had fallen. But I determined this should never be, as long as I had any influence left, and though I could not prevent him from taking more than was good for him, still, by incessant perseverance, by kindness, and firmness, and vigilance, by coaxing and daring, and determination, I succeeded in preserving him from absolute bondage to that detestable propensity, so insidious in its advances, so inexorable in its tyranny, so disastrous in its effects. And here I must not forget that I am not a little indebted to his friend Mr. Hargrave. About that time he frequently called at Grassdale, and often dined with us, on which occasions I fear Arthur would willingly have cast prudence and decorum to the winds, and made a night of it, as often as his friend would have consented to join him in that exalted pastime; and if the latter had chosen to comply, he might, in a night or two, have ruined the labour of weeks, and overthrown with a touch the frail bulwark it had cost me such trouble and toil to construct. I was so fearful of this at first, that I humbled myself to intimate to him, in private, my apprehensions of Arthur's proneness to these excesses, and to express a hope that he would not encourage it. He was pleased with this mark of confidence, and certainly did not betray it. On that and every subsequent occasion, his presence served rather as a check upon his host, than an incitement to further acts of intemperance, and he always succeeded in bringing him from the dining-room in good time, and in tolerably good condition. For if Arthur disregarded such intimations as,
"Well, I must not detain you from your lady,"
or,
"We must not forget that Mrs. Huntingdon is alone,"
he would insist upon leaving the table himself to join me, and his host, however unwillingly, was obliged to follow. Hence I learned to welcome Mr. Hargrave as a real friend to the family, a harmless companion for Arthur, to cheer his spirits and preserve him from the tedium of absolute idleness and a total isolation from all society but mine, and a useful ally to me. I could not but feel grateful to him under such circumstances, and I did not scruple to acknowledge my obligation on the first convenient opportunity. Yet, as I did so, my heart whispered all was not right, and brought a glow to my face, which he heightened by his steady, serious gaze, while, by his manner of receiving those acknowledgments, he more than doubled my misgivings. His high delight at being able to serve me was chastened by sympathy for me, and commiseration for himself, about I know not what, for I would not stay to inquire, or suffer him to unburden his sorrows to me. His sighs and intimations of suppressed affliction seemed to come from a full heart, but either he must contrive to retain them within, or breathe them forth in other ears than mine. There was enough of confidence between us already. It seemed wrong that there should exist a secret understanding between my husband's friend and me, unknown to him, of which he was the object. But my afterthought was, if it is wrong, surely Arthur's is the fault, not mine. And indeed I know not whether, at the time, it was not for him rather than myself that I blushed; for, since he and I are one, I so identify myself with him, that I feel his degradation, his failings and transgressions as my own. I blush for him, I fear for him, I repent for him, weep, pray, and feel for him as for myself. But I cannot act for him, and hence I must be, and I am, debased, contaminated by the union, both in my own eyes and in the actual truth. I am so determined to love him, so intensely anxious to excuse his errors, that I am continually dwelling upon them, and labouring to extenuate the loosest of his principles and the worst of his practices, till I am familiarized with vice, and almost a partaker in his sins. Things that formerly shocked and disgusted me, now seem only natural. I know them to be wrong, because reason and God's word declare them to be so, but I am gradually losing that instinctive horror and repulsion which were given me by nature, or instilled into me by the precepts and example of my aunt. Perhaps then I was too severe in my judgments, for I abhorred the sinner as well as the sin. Now I flatter myself I am more charitable and considerate, but am I not becoming more indifferent and insensate too? Fool that I was, to dream that I had strength and purity enough to save myself and him! Such vain presumption would be rightly served, if I should perish with him in the gulf from which I sought to save him. Yet God preserve me from it, and him too. Yes, poor Arthur, I will still hope and pray for you, and though I write as if you were some abandoned wretch, past hope and past reprieve, it is only my anxious fears, my strong desires that make me do so. One who loved you less would be less bitter, less dissatisfied. His conduct has, of late, been what the world calls irreproachable. But then I know his heart is still unchanged, and I know that spring is approaching, and deeply dread the consequences. As he began to recover the tone and vigour of his exhausted frame, and with it something of his former impatience of retirement and repose, I suggested a short residence by the seaside, for his recreation and further restoration, and for the benefit of our little one as well. But no, watering places were so intolerably dull. Besides, he had been invited by one of his friends to spend a month or two in Scotland, for the better recreation of grouse shooting and deer stalking, and had promised to go. "Then you will leave me again, Arthur?" said I.
Yes, dearest, but only to love you the better when I come back, and make up for all the past offences and shortcomings. And you needn't fear me this time. There are no temptations on the mountains, and during my absence you may pay a visit to Stanningley if you like. Your uncle and aunt have long been waiting us to go there, you know, but somehow there's such a repulsion between the good lady and me that I never could bring myself up to the scratch.
About the third week in August, Arthur set out for Scotland, and Mr. Hargrave accompanied him thither, to my private satisfaction. Shortly after, I, with little Arthur and Rachel, went to Stanningley, my dear old home, which, as well as my dear old friends its inhabitants, I saw again with mingled feelings of pleasure and pain so intimately blended, that I could scarcely distinguish the one from the other, or tell to which to attribute the various tears, and smiles, and sighs, awakened by those old familiar scenes, and tones, and faces. Arthur did not come home till several weeks after my return to Grassdale, but I did not feel so anxious about him now. To think of him engaged in active sports among the wild hills of Scotland was very different from knowing him to be immersed amid the corruptions and temptations of London. His letters now, though neither long nor lover-like, were more regular than ever they had been before, and when he did return, to my great joy, instead of being worse than when he went, he was more cheerful, and vigorous, and better in every respect. Since that time I have had little cause to complain. He still has an unfortunate predilection for the pleasures of the table, against which I have to struggle and watch. But he has begun to notice his boy, and that is an increasing source of amusement to him within doors, while his fox hunting and coursing are a sufficient occupation for him without, when the ground is not hardened by frost, so that he is not wholly dependent on me for entertainment. But it is now January, spring is approaching, and, I repeat, I dread the consequences of its arrival. That sweet season, I once so joyously welcomed as the time of hope and gladness, awakens now far other anticipations by its return.
End of chapter 30.